I want to thank all of you who are part of our Women United organization. And if you're joining us for the first time, we welcome you especially and hope you'll consider joining this impressive group of women thought leaders in our work. Also, I must say a special thanks to our Alliance members. It is the support of these organizations that allow us to bring forward such relevant, timely, and often courageous conversations as you'll be part of today. So we're extremely grateful for the vital role that each of them play in the fabric of our community. As way of background about Women United, it was originally known as the Women's Leadership Council of Trident United Way, and created in 2009 to form a powerful and passionate network of women who are members of Trident United Way's leadership giving societies. The vision of Women United is three-part. One is to engage and encourage and certainly recognize women leaders in our community, educate members about the impact of their contributions on our community, and position and highlight women as the key philanthropic leaders that they are across the region. You will see their fingerprints across our community, and their work truly informs all aspects of our work at Trident United Way. And so at Trident United Way, we have been playing an especially important role in responding in this last year to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we know is that people and families are hurting, and they're relying on the work that we all do more than ever. And that is why it is so important that groups like Women United shine a light on issues that have been magnified by the pandemic, and certainly domestic violence is key among those. We have some extraordinary speakers for you today, from whom we will learn about the cycle of domestic violence in our region. We're proud to support their respective organizations and missions by partnering with My Sister's House for their Walk a Mile event. You may also recall that Christian Rainey and his organization, Men Against Domestic Violence, was featured in one of our recent conversations on race and health equity. Our strong working partnerships with these organizations is absolutely essential to how we collectively serve our neighbors. And because today's conversation is of such significance, we will be recording the session with the permission of our guests in order to capture what I believe will be an essential dialogue. And so speaking of partnerships, one of our celebrated longstanding partnerships in our community is with our very own, the Poston Courier. Most recently, we worked with the Poston Courier to deploy more than $500,000 with our donors through the Tri-County COVID-19 Response Fund, which funded 25 agencies to assist more than 67,000 people, impacting more than 13,000 households. These resources were lifelines for so many, providing food, housing, utility assistance, all because of this partnership. And due to that partnership, those funds were further leveraged to provide a total value to our community of $1.1 million. So certainly sincerest thanks are due always from Trident United Way to the Poston Courier for partnering with us to carry out our mission and to serve and meet the most critical needs in our community. For purposes of today's discussion, I wanted to highlight the work that the Poston Courier has done to educate our community about domestic violence. And we have a clip that we would like to start with this afternoon, that will set the tone for today's discussion.
Haws, and then he went up to Mr. Bergen. They wanted to be elected, so we tried to pull that off. But you showed by virtue of that action, you showed all you.
We told them that we love them, and do everything for them.
Everybody said that you did it's all this bad. And then the locator, everything 17. There were nightly fights, physical, emotional abuse was always in the house.
And I can kind of still really hear it to this day. I can like remember the scream to after going there and close out fireplace caskets. And just, I just knew that there was no way that this is supposed to happen. I didn't even realize doing that. He was like really stabbing her. I just got so blood.
Very, very violent, very, very loud, very, very physical. I was continuously assaulted at least 3 times a night. I was being raped. And he said, I grabbed her by the neck and I twisted.
I turned up and looked up and I was in shock. I was like, a gun. And the last words he said to me was, I can't have you, nobody can. And he pulled the trigger and my head exploded.
What an incredible piece of journalism. And how fortunate are we in this region to be in a community that has a Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper, and also fortunate that today's moderator was a key contributor to the piece that you just saw. Jennifer Berry Haws is a reporter on the Poston Courier's Watchdog and Public Service team, which handles investigative and other in-depth stories. She worked on the team that won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service in 2015 and was a Pulitzer finalist in feature writing in 2019. The piece that you just saw, Till Death Do Us Part, was an in-depth investigation on domestic violence in our state, the policies in place, and the community conditions that have allowed such a system to endure. If you haven't had a chance to read that piece, you will know after today's discussion that it is an absolute must-read. Jennifer also has a book called Grace Will Lead Us Home about the Emmanuel AME church shootings. It was published in 2019 by St. Martin's Press. It has won numerous national awards and was named a New York Times Notable Book of 2019. And we all know what that work and what that incident has meant and how it has begun to change, not just our community, but our nation. And so, Jennifer, we're extremely pleased and honored to have you moderate this discussion today. For all of you, Jennifer has worked with the Poston Courier since 1998, and we're just absolutely delighted, Jennifer, that you and your family call the Lowcountry home. So thank you, and with that, I will turn it over to you, Jennifer.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and definitely to talk about this topic, and I'm very excited to introduce the panelists. I think it's going to be a really amazing conversation. So why don't I start off and talk just a little bit about Till Death Do Us Part to lay the groundwork for a discussion about where we are in South Carolina and the Low Country in particular. I think the origins of this project speak a lot about why it's a problem in South Carolina. It actually began in around 2013, 2014, when a group called the Violence Policy Center put out a press release that it puts out every fall announcing the rankings of states by the number of women who have been killed by men and what how bad you are basically compared with other states. And that year, the press release said that South Carolina ranked #1, meaning we were the worst. And it was not a bombshell, to be honest, because South Carolina at that point had already ranked #1 3 different times out of the 15 years that this report had been put together. And initially, our response was, okay, of course, we'll write a daily story about this ranking and the fact that we're #1. But we had become really jaded to the fact that the state always ranked in the top 10. It had ranked in the top 10 every year that the report was put out. And somebody, who was not me, had the wherewithal to say, wait a second, why is South Carolina doing so poorly? Why are we #1? And that year, our murder rate for women was twice the national average. So we said we need to step back and take a deeper look at this. It's a problem that's right in front of our eyes, and the way that I think it's right in front of many of our eyes, we need to do something about that. And so when we began looking around, we realized that there was not very much data kept. There was not a statewide method for keeping tabs on how many people had been killed in domestic homicides, what weapon was used, what time of year, if the perpetrator had a prior record. There was not any kind of systemic, there was not a database, for instance, you could go to get this information. So we decided to put it together ourselves. And we took 10 years worth of data, starting with the Attorney General's Office silent witness lists, which, if you're not familiar with those, um, there's a ceremony that the Attorney General's Office holds every year. It's a very solemn event where they read off the names of women that have been killed that year and a little bit about them. We started with that list each year, and then we scoured news reports. We talked to coroners and police and sheriff's offices, all these different agencies to compile a database that listed the people who had been killed, what weapon was used, all kinds of other information that if you have this quantifiable view into the problem, you can come up with solutions. So not surprisingly, we found that guns were the #1 weapon used. In 7 out of 10 cases, firearms were the weapon. But what was perhaps more surprising was that if you look at 10 years, 300 women had been killed. So that's roughly 1 woman killed every 12 days. And when you look at it through that lens, you really understand the enormity of the problem. So what to do about it? Very little at that point had been done. In fact, the legislature that year had blocked efforts to keep firearms out of the hands of abusers. And myriad bills that had come before them to help protect victims had languished in committees and died, all except for one bill that protected the pets of someone who's accused of domestic violence. So that alone said a lot about where the state legislature was at the time in terms of doing anything about this problem. In the meantime, we found other indicators that were important. For instance, every county in South Carolina at that time had an animal shelter, but only 18 counties had a shelter for victims of domestic violence. And that meant that about 400 people had been turned away because there wasn't space for them. Now, keep in mind, this was several years ago, so that has changed some. But we also wanted to answer some other broader questions like, are certain women in certain demographics more at risk of domestic violence? And the short answer is no. We were able to easily demonstrate that women who are victims are suburban, urban, rural, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, old, young. There was no pattern there. That this is something that affects women, all kinds of women. And in fact, the lead image of the series was an amalgam of all of the women that had been killed. And you can see from looking at their pictures, to me that was very moving to see them all as living, breathing women who all look different, we're all different ages, and to really realize this is all of us. This is something that affects all of us. The other thing we wanted to answer was this question of, why do women stay in these relationships? Why do they return to these relationships? And we wanted to get away from the idea of blaming the victim. It was her fault that she went back to the relationship, that sort of thing, to better understand what was at play. And I think one of the most telling things that I learned was early on. Early on, we went to my sister's house, and you'll hear from Tasha in a minute, who's the CEO there now, and her predecessor, Elmir Raven, met with us, and we had a great conversation about the problem. And when we were leaving, I asked her, why do you think women stay in relationships like we've been discussing? And she said, well, it's because of till death do us part. And that obviously became the name of this project, and to me really spoke to the complexity of the issues of love and commitment and faith, but also control and power that are at play here. And also to the issue of fear, because I think what a lot of people don't realize, and we can certainly talk about today, and I hope the series illuminated, was that women are at most risk when they try to leave or when they file charges. And in fact, my sister's house had on its website at the time, and I apologize, I don't know if it's still on there, this phrase. It says, the most dangerous time for a victim is when leaving the relationship. 50% of injuries and 75% of domestic homicides occur after the relationship ends. And I thought that was really important to understand how women get trapped in that cycle of violence. And I do want to add, we focused on women in this series. And when I say women, I want to also indicate that men obviously also are victims of domestic violence. We focused on women in this series. So when I say women, that's why. But that fear permeates, and one of the continuing issues that's been problematic is the number of firearms in South Carolina and the ease with which people can obtain them. However, after the series ran, one of the more rewarding things for us as journalists was to see the legislature step up and pass a reform bill that had some important changes in it. One was creating harsher penalties for perpetrators based on the severity of the violence. And another one was a ban on firearms for those who are convicted even of misdemeanor violence. And that, as all of us here in South Carolina know, was difficult to pass because of this strong attachment to the Second Amendment here. So we were very excited that the legislature did something that year. And in fact, one of our panelists was involved with those conversations, and we can talk more about them later if you're interested. But it's interesting now, after a few years have gone by, South Carolina finally did get out of the top 10 on the Violence Policy Center's annual report, and it was ranked number 11, which is still not fantastic, obviously, but an improvement nonetheless. And so I hope that we can continue to make improvements in the state that save the lives of people who are in these relationships. One thing that might be worth mentioning is that here we are again talking about an open carry bill this year. So maybe our panelists can discuss that. But I do want to introduce them and just briefly mention the format today. for everyone. We're we do have a chat box, so if you want to put questions in throughout, you certainly can do that. We'll probably try to answer most of them at the end. Definitely want at the end to hear your questions, and feel free to ask them yourselves and to interact with the panelists. There is a raise your hand function if you'd like to use that. As we go, certainly do that. But I also wanted to mention, if you have a comment or a question that you would like to ask one of the panelists privately, you'll see that there's also an option to do that. So if you don't want to share it with the group, you're certainly invited to reach out directly to the presenters if you'd like. But with that, I'd like to move on to our first panelist, because we have two really great ones that you're going to want to hear from. First is going to be Tasha Connors. So Tasha is CEO of My Sister's House, I mentioned earlier. My Sister's House, if you're not familiar with it, you really should be. It's a very critical nonprofit that works to break the cycle of domestic violence by providing comprehensive support, services, and education, both in its shelter and also beyond. Tasha has been serving in the nonprofit field for over 15 years. She began her career in Athens, Georgia, then moved to Washington, D.C., New York, and Atlanta. She is, we're proud to say, a South Carolina native. She holds a bachelor's degree in public affairs from Columbia College and a master's degree in public administration from the University of Georgia. Tasha moved back to Charleston in 2017 and was tapped to lead My Sister's House then. She and her husband have 3 energetic little boys and a beautiful rescue pup. And so we're really excited to have her. She's a great advocate, and really looking forward to hearing what Tasha has to say about this issue as we move forward. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I appreciate it. I'm Tasha Connors, and like Jennifer said, I came here about 4 years ago. I actually started going to undergrad at COC and pretty much wasted my parents' money and had to come back later. But it's so nice to be back in the Charleston area. You know, when I got to My Sister's House, I knew that domestic violence was a problem, but I didn't even understand the scope of what was happening in my own home state, even though I have several close friends and family members who have been victims of domestic violence. Once I got here and I started to understand and read more about what was happening, it was really eye-opening. And I'll say that every time that I go out and I do a presentation or I'm interviewing somebody for a job, everybody says, you know, well, this means so much to me because I'm a survivor of DV. And the sad thing is that when people reveal that to me, they're saying it as if they're one of the only ones, and I hear it everywhere, and it's heartbreaking, and I think really indicative of the problem that's happening here in South Carolina. So we'll go through the slides. We'll talk about some of the statistics that are happening in the state. We'll touch on some of the things that Jennifer's already mentioned and things that were presented in the Till Death Do Us Part series. Next slide. And next slide. Thank you. Just to piggyback, I'll say she or women a lot because 85% of most DV victims are women. At My Sister's House, we've actually seen a slight increase over the past few months of the number of men who have been reaching out to us, but that's why we use those pronouns. And you'll see from some of these statistics too that domestic violence is often a leading cause of homelessness, typically the third leading cause of homelessness for women or families. So we see a lot of crossover between clients who are either coming to My Sister's House and going to 180 Place or vice versa. When we talk about somebody's fear or reluctance to leave, right, that's usually the first question that we get. If she's being abused, why doesn't she just leave? And there are myriad of reasons why somebody doesn't leave. First and foremost, it could just be, I love that person and I just want the abuse to stop, right? I love my husband, I love my wife, I love my partner. I just want him to stop hitting me. So I don't want to break up the family. I want to stay together, but we need to address this issue. Also in Charleston, a lot of the clients that we have, it's very expensive. So if you don't have the resources to leave, housing and affordable housing has almost become an oxymoron in this area. Trying to find a place that you can afford, that you can live safely with your children. Trying to find transportation if you don't have a car. And again, public transportation is a very large barrier for our clients. There are a lot of reasons why somebody might not be able to leave that relationship, or perhaps they have, because we know statistically that a victim will leave her abuser 7 to 10 times before she leaves for good. So frequently we will see the cycle of women coming back into our shelter 2-3 times. So we know that it's going to take a while. If you have been stuck in this cycle of fear of control, if you have not had a job, if you have been isolated from your family, your friends, your support network, it's very difficult to say pick up your children and leave. If I were in that situation and I had not had a job for several years, or I didn't have the education or the experience to go out and have a living wage and find affordable housing, it would be very difficult to just pick up my 3 kids and go somewhere on my own if I didn't have those resources. So there are a lot of barriers that will keep a victim in that relationship. Also, when we talk about domestic violence, we oftentimes use intimate partner violence. So as it's defined in the state, it's a little bit different. It's not a grandmother calling saying that her grandson has hit her. We specifically are dealing with somebody where you have children in common, you have previously lived or lived with that person. It is your spouse, former spouse, but there's some sort of intimate partnership there. And in the past few years, they also changed the laws to include same-sex relationships because that previously was not recognized in our state, and now it is. So the types of cases that we can see, as Jennifer mentioned, it really is across the spectrum. There's not one type of DV client, and it really doesn't matter your race, your ethnicity, how you identify, your socioeconomic status. We see everything in between when people are reaching out to My Sister's House. Next. Here's some of the stats that are about South Carolina in particular. A lot of these were taken from the CDC. You'll see where we're ranked number 11 in the nation for women murdered by men. And the one thing that I want to point out about that statistic, although we were certainly happy to see us drop out of the top 10, if you go back and you look at those silent witness reports from the Attorney General's office, the raw numbers in our state alone keep jumping. So from 2016 data to 2019, that number has been 39 women, 40, 41, 42. So we keep seeing that number creep up. And I think it's a indication to us that we still have a lot of work to do. And I think there are different ways, whether it's our organization or Christian Rainey, the solicitor's office, figuring out who the right partners are to get around the table and having these sort of interdisciplinary conversations so we can make some continued change in our state. But you'll see here that 41% of South Carolinian women will have some sort of intimate partner violence, and we recognize IPV or intimate partner violence, being physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, and financial is often one of the most common types of abuses, and typically they're co-occurring, right? So if you have a lot of verbal abuse or physical abuse, typically you will see financial abuse coupled with those as well. So a lot of times our clients are experiencing more than one type of abuse. And I just want to point out the issue with the guns as well. You'll see the stat there at the bottom, but we know that when guns are present, that it can increase the lethality of a situation by up to 500%. So it's a very real issue in our state, trying to get a handle on the guns, and particularly abusers. Maybe from getting new guns, but if an abuser is convicted and they currently own guns, who's going to take that gun from them? How are we going to track that? Those are the kinds of things that victims are asking us when they're thinking about their safety and the safety of their children. Next slide. So this is our mission, and I'll say that we're celebrating My Sister's House, our 40th anniversary. And so for almost 40 years, we've really been known as an emergency shelter. And in the past few years, we have set a lot of different standards for ourselves here internally, because we recognize that the majority of cases around domestic violence, one, are not even being reported, but two, the majority of victims are not coming into shelter. And we need to be able to pivot and address the needs of the community, particularly over the past year with COVID. So I'll get into some of our services. Next slide. These are some of our we believe statements. So we recently went through a strategic planning process with our board, and we were affirming with ourselves what we believe, what is important to us. These are the values that we have when we think about implementing new programs, when we think about how we want to interact with victims, how we want to remain trauma informed, and continue to educate ourselves around the best way to get a victim from victimhood to survivorhood. Next slide. So these are services that we offer. Like I said, we have really grown from more than just an emergency shelter. We have a 24-hour crisis line. So this line is direct to our shelter. Our staff are trained extensively to answer crisis calls. Not everybody who calls us is an immediate crisis, but they might have other issues that they're working through. They can talk with an advocate. Sometimes they just need somebody to hear their story. They haven't been able to tell anybody their story. And surprisingly, there are a lot of clients who call us and they don't even know if they are in a domestic abusive situation. I had somebody who emailed me about 3 years ago, and she said that, she would hold her child and her husband would get drunk and he would punch her. And she wanted to know if that was domestic violence. And the reason that she was asking is because that is how she grew up. Her husband grew up in a very violent household, and so did this woman. So it was normalized for her. And for a lot of victims who grow up seeing this, they just think it's normal. They're not sure if it's wrong. So we actually have a lot of clients who will call us. And again, it's somebody to hear their story for the first time. They can get resources. Maybe they're not even looking for shelter. They just want to figure out if they can talk to a therapist. But it's having an advocate who is trained, who is there to listen to them and provide an intake to our services. So the 24-hour crisis line, again, is staffed at our shelter, and it is the entry point and the first point of entry for all of our services here at My Sister's House. We have really grown our clinical department, which is very rewarding to say. So we have a therapist who resides in shelter. We have a therapist for clients who are out of shelter, and then we have a parent-child advocate. She works with our clients, typically who are in shelter, who have children. And she works through a program called Triple P Parenting. It's an evidence-based program that we have recently employed with our clients. So again, we're trying to give them the tools that they need to become better parents. Sometimes they haven't had the role models or the processes in place to be able to really focus on themselves or their children in a way that they need to. And we recognize that our clients really can't heal. They can't move along on their journey if they don't have time for self-reflection, if they don't have time to work through some of the trauma that they have experienced. So when a client is calling, if they have insurance, then we have a list of therapists that are trauma informed that we will refer them out to. So all of the clients that we are providing service to literally have no other resources to assist them, and we're there for them. Our advocacy program, that is with our court advocate. So we have a bilingual court advocate. She will help victims file orders of protection. She can go with them to a court hearing. Sometimes for our victims, it is the first time that they are seeing their abuser when they show up in court. And sometimes that abuser doesn't even have to say anything to the victim. They're just giving that look. And the victim knows what that look means. And it's terrifying. And a lot of times they will recant or they'll want to pull back. And this is where we have to educate judges and attorneys and other advocates around what the cycle looks like, because that victim has been living in fear for so long, they just automatically go back in survival mode. So it's nice to have somebody who is there sort of explaining the process to you and helping you understand what to expect when you're in court. We have an education and training program. So we recently launched earlier this year a partner pledge program. This is with businesses where they sign on saying that they care about domestic violence, they care about supporting their community and their staff. And when an agency signs our partner pledge, saying that this is important to them, our director of training and education will do a training for all of their staff, and then she will do a specialized training for the C-suite individuals. So they get to recognize the signs of abuse. They know what to do if an employee comes to them and shares that they are in an abusive situation. They have immediate access to all of the services and the referrals that we would give any other client who is calling the hotline. And again, it's a public affirmation that this is a problem, that everybody is acknowledging it, and that their company is really taking the steps to move forward and provide their employees with the resources that they need. Obviously, we have our emergency shelter. So that changed with COVID. What we are doing and what we will continue to do. Our physical shelter location is confidential for obvious reasons, but we reduced capacity in shelter so we can keep everybody socially distanced and safe. So previously we could accommodate up to 36 individuals. It was congregate living, and now it's one individual or family per room. And then we're also using a variety of hotels throughout the Tri-County area. So we will continue with this hybrid situation for emergency shelter for at least the next calendar year. And then we have case management. So case management is one of those things that is automatically included when you come into shelter. But we have also expanded our community program in the past year where we have a community case manager. Right now, it's really more of a pilot program. So we have individuals who are leaving the shelter, and then they can work with our community case manager for an additional 4 to 6 months. The idea is to provide them stability, financial planning, accountability, and resources, because we want that victim, like I said, to move from victim to survivor and be able to thrive. And it's very tough to do if you're on your own. So we recognize that a lot of our clients need ongoing support, and that's what we're here for. Next slide. If you have any questions, you're welcome to email me directly. Our crisis line is there. Again, it is 24 hours a day. It goes straight to our shelter. And we have a variety of resources. If you are in a dangerous situation or you have a family member or a friend, please go to our website, mysistershouse.org, and you'll be able to find all of the resources that you need. Thank you.
Thank you, Tasha. That was super interesting. And I just encourage everybody who knows someone who needs these services, or if you need them yourself, to reach out. So let me introduce our next speaker, Christian Rainey. Christian was instrumental for us in Till Death Do Us Part, and I'm happy to see him here. He is the founder and CEO of MAD USA, which stands for Men Against Domestic Violence and Abuse. It's an organization that's committed to shining a light on critical issues surrounding domestic violence. At MAD, Christian is responsible for teaching in schools, training, awareness events, and collaborating with other agencies. This is, if you don't know Christian, this is all very personal for him. His passion for this work began after he lost 5 family members to domestic violence and became deeply committed to helping others. He is particularly motivated to mentor young men to change how future generations look at this problem and approach their own relationships. Christian was appointed to be part of South Carolina's Domestic Violence Task Force, which was set up after Till Death Ran, and was instrumental in helping to pass the domestic violence reform bill that I mentioned earlier and get it through the General Assembly that passed in 2015. In addition to his work with MAD, Christian is also a captain with the North Charleston Fire Department. So if you've seen him out in the community, that's why. If it wasn't related to an event regarding domestic violence, he's just super active and involved in a lot of things. And so I want to turn it over to Christian. We're thrilled to see you. Christian, need to unmute.
So yeah, sorry. Before I even get started, I would like to definitely give a early happy Mother's Day to all the moms that may be on the line. Y'all are obviously a blessing to all of the children in the world, and obviously we wouldn't be here without you. So just wanted to say thank you. Tasha obviously did a phenomenal job of covering the what I would consider the huge gauntlet of issues that we have in South Carolina pertaining to domestic violence. So I'm going to kind of take a audible and I'm going to just kind of talk about what we do here at MAD and just kind of talk about our philosophy and our change of approach as far as how we educate. So over at MAD, our main focus is proactive education. We believe in order to break the cycle of domestic violence, we have to start with kids at a very young age in order to teach them what a healthy relationship is. We also provide emergency services. So when my sister's house is at capacity, which they have their hybrid program now, which is fantastic. But when those resources are not available, we provide bus tickets. We've bought plane tickets, Ubers, hotel accommodations for victims who are in emergency situations that can't get out right at that particular time. And our main focus is particularly education. The biggest lesson that I've learned over the time that I've been an advocate for domestic violence was having breakfast with an atheist, whom people told me that I probably shouldn't have met with, but I feel like you can learn more from someone who you don't have something in common with. And so in that breakfast, he challenged me with a question, and it changed my whole perspective on how I view relationships, how I view domestic violence, and how we pursue our education. And so the way that I rephrased this question to myself or to everyone is, do you believe we are born knowing what love is, or are we taught what love is? And as a child who grew up in a household where I experienced domestic violence from the age of 6, in my mind, love was just a universal language that I felt like everybody understood what a healthy relationship was. Even though what I was seeing in my household wasn't healthy, I found it to be normal because that's the only thing that I knew. And so, I feel like we have to, I guess when it comes to life, we have to really question ourselves, how do we learn what love is? And so the first thing that I would say is when we talk about the definition of love, we usually talk about the physical sense or the touchy feeling stuff, but we never talk about that deeper connection of how we learn how to love and what we accept as love and how we consider love maybe opening, maybe what we consider love maybe an opening to a relationship that could be filled with domestic violence. And, all of our definitions, if I were to ask everybody on this panel or everybody on this call, uh, what their definition of love is, or their perfect relationship is, all of ours will be different in certain aspects because our love languages are different. So we have to look at our foundation of love. And our foundation of love is typically our parents, the household that we grew up in. And so if we grow up in a household, uh, in an environment where love and violence coexist, it's going to be very difficult for us to learn how to love without violence. And so that foundation is very pivotal in how we choose our partners, the relationships that we enter. And so you will see a statistic that will say 85% of children who are involved or grow up in a home where they experience domestic violence will either be abused or become an abuser, simply because it's a learned behavior. And so, with that being known, we understand that if we really want to break that cycle of domestic violence, there's different layers that have to be involved. And so at first we started off educating kids only at the high school level. And then my fifth grade teacher challenged me to engage elementary school and the middle school kids. And because she said that, well, when you look at bullying, what is the difference in that behavior? All of it's about power and control. It's the pillars of domestic violence. And so we started doing education K through 5, based on strictly bullying, teaching people just how to have relationships with each other, based on friendship. And, middle school and high school, we talk about teen dating and domestic violence and educate them in those terms. So we have done colleges, we've trained the fire department, police department, faith-based. We've done some training with the Air Force Base as well. And, we just find it very vital that our youth be steered in a direction where they at least have a chance that someone can tell them what a healthy relationship is. Because from the age, I would say when I was in fifth grade, is when we started learning reproductive health. And, on through middle school, we learn about, sex and different things like that. And one thing that I wondered was if they teach us, I would say, the most complicated things about relationships, why aren't we taught the basics of what a healthy relationship is in the first place? Because we know that the households that we grow up in, they're not a guarantee that those are going to be a healthy household that has, a healthy relationship for us to kind of mirror ourselves off and thrive off of. And so we know that, once those kids get out of that elementary school age, they start really leaning on their peers to really identify themselves and what they consider to be healthy relationships. And they're also exposed, obviously, to mass media. And with cell phones now, I mean, you have just about everything at your fingertips that's not healthy. So, they don't have the perfect example of what those healthy relationships are. And so we feel like in order to kind of create that buffer and and teach them, at least give them a chance to learn what a healthy relationship is outside of their home, we provide them with that proactive education. And I mean, I mean, like Jennifer said, my passion for teaching kids is mainly, from losing my family. In order to do what I do now, I had to lose everything for it to even come to my attention. I will tell you, when my family was murdered, I had no idea that it was domestic violence, and I was 20 years old at the time. Because I grew up in a household, and I remember very distinctly, roughly about 8 to 9 months before that, my mom had gotten a check or something in the mail, and I was in college at the time, and she was like, "Well, I'm going to send you some money," but she was like, "Don't tell Michael," who was her husband. And in my mind, I told her, I was like, well, I wouldn't tell him anyway. But, in my mind, it didn't register, like financial abuse. I didn't really understand that aspect. And when we talk about why victims don't leave, I mean, Tasha said it perfectly. I mean, if you don't have the resources to leave, where are you going to go? Especially when you look at power and control and you look at isolation. Once you're isolated from your family, you're isolated from your friends, you're isolated from resources that could possibly help you get out of those situations. And we see it every day. I mean, people with kids, I mean, it makes it, 10 times more difficult to leave that situation. And I just didn't really understand what domestic violence was. I didn't understand why people stayed. But over time, I made it my mission to really educate myself on domestic violence. And as I did, I started seeing more and more signs of stuff that my mom was dealing with that I didn't even understand outside of the physical role. So that has just been my driving force, is really just to take their legacy and turn it from the tragedy that it is into potentially saving young kids' life from not ending up in those situations, whether it be dealing with their parents or whether it be in their personal lives. It's basically we're trying to uh, just stop the cycle in South Carolina. I mean, it's very exhausting and tiring at times, reading the stats. While we are excited, rightfully so, that we're out of the top 10, as we stated, the numbers are still the same, which means the numbers are rising someplace else and kicking us kind of down. But we're still 2 times the national average. We still have a lot of work to do. Even if you look at it from a law standpoint, in Senate Bill 3, we passed a lot of phenomenal things when it came to stiffening laws. But one thing that we have failed to do in South Carolina is have uniformity as far as sentencing is concerned, as far as making sure we have a check and balance system when these guns are removed from the house. Our gun laws, I mean, we don't have a gun database. You buy a gun today and you can sell it to somebody tomorrow, and you don't have to fill out anything to say that you sold it. There's no law against that. So, when we're trying to stop perpetrators from gunning down domestic violence victims, whether they're male or female, it's still been an uphill battle. While we have made strides, it's still an uphill battle, and we still have work to do. I just got a phone call Saturday while I was coaching a game from one of my close friends, and she said that one of her friends got choked out by a guy in front of her kids, and they charged him with DV3, and that's not right. That's not the way that the law was written, and it's not the way that they should have been charged. And those are the things that we have to continually fight and continually trying to check on to make sure that people are being prosecuted properly. Because I mean, we know that if they bail out, the possibilities of that person losing their life skyrocket. And at some point in time, somebody has to take responsibility for the actions of how these people are being sentenced or how they're being released. But one of the main things that we have to do is keep applying pressure on the legislators to stiffen these laws, and we have to find a way to unite our 46 counties to make sure that we are sentencing people in a uniform way. We have to be very stiff, and some people may get upset about it, but at the end of the day, we've lost enough. I mean, personally, I'm just tired of going to the State House every year and seeing silhouettes of people losing their life at the hands of someone who claimed that they love them. Um, it's it's sad. But the biggest things that we can do as a community is continue to support our partners, continue to work together, continue to educate, continue to make sure that we have resources for our victims. And as Jennifer said, I mean, in the state of South Carolina, we have 46 counties, 18 shelters, and every county has an animal shelter. And as she stated with the pet laws, I mean, at the time you would get more time for beating your dog than you would beating your wife. So at some point in time, South Carolina laws have to reflect their values, or the values that the people believe, and that our women are valuable and they deserve to have the resources, male and female, deserve to have the resources available to deal with this problem. There's no way that we can be in the top 10 from the existence of them keeping this data or tracking this kind of data, and we have never received the proper resources that we've needed to help.
Thank you, Christian. That's all really useful and important information. I think we'll turn to questions now. So why don't I see already a question in the chat, and I'll read and remind everyone you're welcome to put a question in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question directly, please, I encourage you to make this a conversation. But I'll start with reading this one in the chat. Did North Charleston ever receive the funding for the interdisciplinary team response mentioned in Till Death Do Us Part? Have other cities in South Carolina implemented this type of response since then? So this is the interdisciplinary team response. Christian and Tasha, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, so I know that there are a few different sort of interdisciplinary teams that have formed, right? There's one that's headed through MUSC, and then there's one, it's called the Domestic Violence Coordinating Council, which was really spearheaded, I believe, from the solicitor's office. And this is where a lot of victim advocates, nonprofits, LEVAs or law enforcement victim advocates get together and really talk about the issues, try and formulate their own sort of mini strategic plan for the area. Again, covering this Tri-County area. So yes, some of those things have happened. Since I wasn't here when the series came out, I can't really speak to some of the progress from 2015 to 2017. And, you know, I have my own personal feelings on how well some of these things may or may not be working. I think to Christian's point, though, it is so vital that we find an effective way to work together, not just in name, but that we're actually doing the work and that people agree on the best way to sort of break the barriers that victims have. And I think if we can, again, remain trauma-informed and victim-centered, it can't just be what Tasha thinks victims need, or my sister's house, or Christian, or anybody else, but really listening to the victims, right? What are they telling us that they need? And us as a community putting those resources together in a way that makes sense. So I think the Till Death Do Us Part series was so pivotal because it gave a voice to victims, and it really humanized them in a way that maybe previously didn't exist. And I think we need more of that. And I'd be interested to know what Christian thinks about that as well.
I would also, I guess I would say, echo what you said. I mean, I think that, you know, what we've put together since 2015 has had some great things come of it, some great partnerships. But, you know, I think that we have to do a better job of coming up with a plan to move in a direction and, you know, possibly strategically planning out how we're going to approach the different needs, especially with COVID and the way things have really just shifted in the last year. And I mean, obviously, very quickly, we had to kind of just pick up and figure out a way to, you know, get around it. But I think that we definitely need to do a better job of working together, collaborating, combining resources in order to really make waves, not just in the Tri-County area, but throughout the state. We obviously we have the, you know, the Tri-County Victim Coordinating Council, and we've done some good work. But obviously, with the numbers that we have, we still have a lot of work to do. and we need to really start pounding the pavement on resources, because we can't continue to put that much of a strain on one shelter within the Tri-County area. More resources are needed.
And I also want to point out too that Christian and I were both part of a press conference that happened in early February. So with North Charleston PD. So in North Charleston alone, before by January 22nd of this year. So, 22 days, there were 3 DV murders that happened in North Charleston. And we were there along with North Charleston PD to really bring light to the issue, because 3 murders in 22 days is absolutely unacceptable. 1 murder is unacceptable. So I think it really lit a fire, an additional fire under all of us, but recognizing that the need is there. We know it's there, and it's growing. And I think it really means that we have to be more innovative in how we respond to victims. It just can't be the old standard, because it's not working. So I think what Christian's doing and focusing on the education is very important. I think it has to start early when we talk about creating healthy relationships and giving young children the guidelines and the boundaries around what's healthy and what's unhealthy. And when Christian talks about resources, there's a lot of money that has come down from the feds through COVID and some other things, but there are a lot of restrictions that get tied to that money. And it's very tough to find money for prevention. It's very tough to find money for education. And those are the things that are really going to make a big difference. You can't say that, you sheltered 10 people in one night, but I think there's some other outcomes that are just as important that we have to learn to focus on.
To that point, could each of you talk a little bit about how your organizations are funded? Are they funded entirely through private dollars, or do you have access to state and federal money as well?
Yeah, so at my sister's house, it's a combination. I'd say roughly 80% of our funding is government funding. So the Victims of Crime Act, VOCA, and then the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, which is actually up for reauthorization. Those are 2 very big, important grants, and then additional monies that flow through DSS. And then, yeah, certainly private dollars make up the rest of that. And that's the area that we really need to grow, and getting the community to understand the importance of domestic violence, of intimate partner violence, and why these things are needed.
Same here. Roughly about 85 to 90% of our funding is governmental funding as well. And as it's a combination between private and government funding, of course, we would want our private donations to go up, and we obviously engage the community not for donations, but letting them know what these organizations in the community are out here doing. Because even though we are very visual in the community, my sister's house, everywhere as well. There are nooks and crannies in the rural areas and even some in the city areas that people don't know the resources that are at their fingertips, literally, that we're offering.
There's a question in the chat that I think goes really to what we were talking about with "Till Death Do Us Part" and that name and what those vows mean. And Lisa Van Bergen asked, what role does the faith community play in responding to domestic violence in our state?
I would say it plays a huge role. I mean, we're a part of the Bible Belt. Obviously, down here, we're considered self-proclaimed the holy city. But sometimes our values don't really, or our actions really don't reflect that at times. I've found it very challenging sometimes in the faith community, because they want to talk about domestic violence, but when you really start breaking down things as far as culture in the faith-based community, how things are said, how things are handled in relationships when it comes to pastors who try to counsel victims and their abusers in the same room, which obviously we know does not work. And also, just from a standpoint of, and I always get in trouble for this, but just a standpoint of how the pastor delivers his message. There are very distinct things in the Bible that speaks on marriage and relationships and roles in relationships. And growing up as a young man, I particularly remember, constantly hearing, the message of wives, be submissive to your husbands. And, as a young man, you really, if you don't have anybody, or if you don't read for yourself, in your mind, if somebody preaches on that for 15, 20, 45 minutes, depending on what church you go to, if somebody preaches that long just on that subject, what you take away from that is women are the property of men, and they do what you say. But as I continue to read as I got older, and I began to understand that there's a lot more direction and instruction to men than it is for women. And I believe that, pastors are very powerful, and their words are very powerful. The delivery is very powerful. And if they're not very careful with how they deliver that, and if their message comes across as male dominating, it can be very unhealthy for the congregation. Because, I mean, when I said this in the church one day, they looked like they wanted to hurt me, because it was something that was never really approached. But I mean, I'm a faith believer myself, but I mean, I'm a realist, and I went and read for myself, and I understand that, as pastors and as a congregation, they hide behind certain things, especially when it comes to domestic violence. But as I say all the time, it's everybody's business when it comes to domestic violence. There's no, oh, it's a personal issue, it's this person's problem. Um, it just needs to be addressed. And, we've done training. I'm pretty sure my sister's house has done training in faith-based as well. And it's really opened the doors and kind of peeled back the curtain on a hidden abuse that has been happening for a long time. And I will tell you, majority of the abusers that I've come across in the faith-based community have been the pastors. And this is not just hearsay. This is actually coming from their wives. So it's a culture change that need to happen.
And if I could just quickly just address some of the myths around who a victim is. We have so many churches who support us, who are absolutely fantastic. And we have had some resistance from some churches where pastors say, you're really advocating for divorce. And we say, we're advocating for healthy relationships. And so, yeah, there's still a lot of learning in certain areas that needs to happen. But one of the things that we hear so frequently is like, it's just poor Black women who are getting murdered, who are in DV situations. We hear it all the time, and it's really unfortunate because that's not the case. It is literally anybody and everybody that domestic violence can and it does affect. So I just want to be 100% transparent that there's no stigma, or there shouldn't be a stigma involved in who is being abused, because it happens across the spectrum. And I think it's very important for people to realize that it could be your neighbor or your friend or somebody who is at church. The amount of people that we know of directly who are in the faith community, or attorneys, or really well-known people in the community who are abusing their spouses. It's shocking and surprising if you're not in this work every day. So it does happen. And if somebody reveals to you that they are in an abusive situation, that you should believe them and direct them to getting the resources that they need, whether it's therapy or shelter or anything else. And so knowing about the resources that exist, like Christian said, is incredibly important.
And go ahead.
Can I piggyback off of something that Tasha said real quick? So, believing the victim is one of the biggest things that that we teach, is because I think sometimes we mistakenly misunderstand how somebody is abused. They don't go in a relationship and 2 days later they're black and blue, right? That person is kind of chipped away at their self-esteem and just their personality in general. So to where they're physically, spiritually, and mentally dependent upon them, and sometimes financially dependent upon them for everything. So when a victim comes to someone and they try to help them or they try to point them in the right direction, and that person goes back and that person kind of throws their hands up and it was like, well, they don't need help, or you're stupid for going back, or whatever they say. The biggest thing about that is what they don't realize is they're reinforcing the same things that their abuser is telling them, that no one's going to help you, no one's going to want you. And we have to be very careful with the language that we use when we help people. Because as I'm pretty sure, Tasha, there are victims that we've helped who have gone back to their abuser 4, 5, 6 times. And anytime they come back, it is our obligation to help them. And eventually eventually they're going to leave. But you have to, if you're going to truly be there for somebody and help, you have to be patient with them, and you cannot uh, basically give strength to the abuser by tearing them down as well.
That's really important. I want to open it up. Is there anyone who's joined us who wants to chime in with a question? I can go on with the chat, but I'd also like to open it up to anybody who would just like to ask a question directly. And if not, then I'll go on. Someone asked, do any of the statistics on interpersonal violence that were mentioned include teens under 18? Do either of you know if the Violence Policy Center numbers include only adult women or also teenage girls?
Yeah, I think that is such a missing piece, is in a lot of the murders that are captured in these numbers, that we're not talking about the children who were also murdered, who were also victims. And so I think it's short-sighted on our part to only look at the primary victim, because there's so many other victims, whether they're murdered or not, that need help. But one of the issues that I have just in this field in general is the lack of data that exists, nationally or for state or even regionally. And that's something that we have talked a lot about internally at my sister's house, around what our data looks like, how we capture it, how we report on it, and how we can collaborate with other organizations or with law enforcement to capture better data. But I think there are some unique opportunities that we have to do that. And I look forward to being able to present more robust numbers in the future, at least from our agency and our standpoint. But I think as a field, as a whole, it is so lackluster and unfortunate.
And it's the same. I mean, trying to find data for uh, anyone under 18, especially when it comes to interpersonal violence, is almost nearly impossible. They have roundabout numbers of, people, 1 out of 10 or 3 out of 10 may be abused or something like that. But there's no hardcore data simply because the laws really don't protect them when it comes to interpersonal violence, because it's going to be logged as assault. It's not going to be logged as, interpersonal violence. And I think that we have to really, and when we look at, Senate Bill 3, I think, we're going to have to kind of evolve it to where it's going to include, finding ways to track data and finding ways to, be able to not just charge somebody with assault if somebody's in a relationship, even though they're 17 or maybe even 18 in high school. That doesn't mean that it's not an interpersonal relationship or interpersonal violence. And not all people, live together as well. So, what about the people who are dating? What about dating violence? There's just so much data that we don't have and that we don't capture because technically the law doesn't, cover it. But that data for teenagers and people under 18 is needed. The only way that we collect data here, especially when it comes to that age group, is through a survey that we give them before we teach them. A confidential survey that kind of gives us a look into, how they understand DV, some of the things that may be involved in their home and what they've experienced. And that's the only kind of data we've been able to kind of collect ourselves. But I mean, it is much needed to be able to effectively inform and educate a community.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And sorry, did somebody want to talk? I think I talked over someone. One thing we found with Till Death was just that there's just generally speaking a real lack of data surrounding this kind of violence. That's why we had to set out really to put it together ourselves. One thing too, I wanted to mention back to the point of the faith community. When we did that series, I had just recently been the newspaper's religion writer, so I sent an informal survey out to something like 36 pastors in the area that I knew, asking questions like, did they consider domestic violence to be a problem in their congregation? Had they given sermons, for instance, on the topic, that sort of thing? And what I found was that almost all of them said they did not feel domestic violence was a problem in their congregation, and almost none of them had delivered any kind of sermon discussing it. So just simply the awareness that a pastor can bring to a congregation is so important. And I'm encouraged by what Tasha mentioned earlier, that faith communities are becoming involved with My Sister's House and other organizations, because I think that's really important. Those pastors have a really critical voice that people will listen to, and I'm hopeful that they'll use that platform more productively. But I did want to ask real quickly. Someone asked in the chat if each of you could talk about volunteer opportunities at your organization, so that the people who want to become involved, or otherwise what they can do.
Yeah, we're really just discussing how to reactivate our volunteer program. We had a massive volunteer program pre-COVID, and obviously suspended it over the past year. We have a small group of people who make up our transition team. So when we have clients who are moving into their own apartment or house, the transition team will go and they will pick up furniture from St. Vincent de Paul or Hope to Home or one of these agencies and bring it to the client's home. Obviously, those volunteers have been background checked and signed confidentiality agreements, and most of us have been with us for quite a long time. So we have that small group, and we have been discussing ways now that the vaccine is available and things are opening up more, how to safely bring volunteers back. So I'd say just subscribe to our newsletter or check our website. So we'll post some upcoming volunteer activities through those means.
And it's the exact same for us. We really had to kind of drop, especially because some of our volunteers were actually high school students. So we had to kind of take a backseat to our volunteers last year, especially with the unknown of COVID, just to make sure that they were safe. And this year, we've been reaching out, back out to our volunteers and also back out to people who are interested in volunteering. And we're hoping that closer to October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, that we will be able to conduct some more events in person and outdoors and things of that nature. So, if they want to get in contact, they are free to contact my cell, 843-608-0434. I'll also put in the chat, and I'll put my email in as well. And you can check out our website and then sign up to volunteer as well. But, we're just really trying to protect everybody and stay safe, especially while the vaccines are trying to roll out, and the fact that they're opening it up to some of the teenagers now, just trying to make sure that everybody's safe and protected.
And Christian, along the message you delivered about healthy relationships, is there an opportunity or a way to try to get that sort of healthy relationship component integrated into the state curriculum?
Okay. Okay. So technically, one of the biggest things that I fought for in Senate Bill 3 was the education piece. So technically, it's in there. Have people enforced it? No. Um, some schools have, complied, but, some schools don't even know that it's written in the law that they're supposed to provide that type of education. So we've just been really just calling different counties, different schools, and just trying to get into their principals, what we have to offer. And, we go in and we do what we have to do. But I would like to definitely see a bigger push for curriculum, not just MAD USA's, but just in general, because I feel like this education is far valuable than just dealing with the Tri-County area. It needs to be throughout the state, really throughout the nation. But we continue to make the push, but obviously with COVID, it just kind of really, I guess, kicked everybody back a couple feet. Um, but I have been in contact with our state superintendent about continuing to make this push for the education portion, not just obviously in our area, but throughout the state of South Carolina.
And I know we need to wrap it up in a minute, but Tasha, do you want to add anything as far as any kind of a call to action as far as what you'd like to see from the legislature moving forward?
Well, I don't think we have enough time for that. But I would just encourage, everybody to pay attention to what's happening in your community, and to reach out to your representatives and to the senators. We are very fortunate that there's some federal legislation around the VOCA bill and a VOCA fix, if you will, that both senators, Tim Scott and Lindsey Graham, have signed on to. And like I said, the VAWA is up for reauthorization, the Violence Against Women Act, which, we're pretty confident that will go through. But I think that, whether it's your council members or your representatives or your senators, that they need to hear from you. They need to know that domestic violence is important, that you care about making these changes in the schools and getting the kinds of resources that we need and frankly that we deserve here.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Tasha. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Jennifer, for moderating. I'm Lisa Van Bergen, everyone, one of the members of the Women United team. I'm really thrilled that we were able to get these speakers in front of you today because this is such an important issue in our community and it does impact everyone. If it hasn't impacted your life personally, I promise you it will, because it has certainly impacted almost everyone that I know, and it's absolutely impacted my life personally. So thank you for taking the time. If we can look at the next slide. These are my sister's house and MAD USA resources. So if you want to jot them down, my sister's house has needs that are listed there. So if you want to make a donation, please consider that. They also have a fantastic resource guide that is on their website if folks are looking for resource guides. So we appreciate that some of you all might be looking for ways to volunteer and to give back. And if for any reason you want this information and aren't able to write it down right now, if you email the Trident United Way as they contacted you about this, we'll get that information out to you. Okay. Just a little heads up, the next slide, Women United is having our annual awards luncheon in October. We had to cancel last year's because of COVID, but we're thrilled that we're going to be having Carolyn Hunter Hayward speak in October, and members of Women United will all, of course, be invited to this luncheon. If you aren't currently a member of Women United, we'd love to have you join. You basically have to be a woman who donates at least $1,000 to United Way, and then you're a member of our group. So the other exciting thing that happens at this luncheon is that we honor several women in the community. So we will be seeking out nominations for that. Soon we'll be looking for a nomination for Nonprofit Leader of the Year, Role Model of the Year, and Hands-on Hero. So when we send those out later on this summer, please respond, because that's the only way we can honor these folks in our community. And it's a very special time to be able to recognize the women who've been giving so much to others. Final note there, I think the next slide, is that we currently, as part of United Way, we're undergoing the 6th annual book drive of the African American Leadership Council. And this is going on until May 15th. And they are right now raising funds for books for students in our community, kindergarten through 3rd grade. And so you can actually make a donation at those locations, the South State Bank location or the Order of the Eastern Star. And if you go on the United Way website under the AALC, it actually has a way that you can go to Amazon and purchase the exact books that they need. So, but you can drop off books on your own. If you want to drop off new or gently used books as well, you can do that. So, at this point, we want to thank you all for participating. We're thrilled to be able to do a Lunch and Learn virtually. It's not quite the same as being in person, but it's great to be able to connect with everyone. And hopefully our next Lunch and Learn will be back in person now that things are getting a little more back to normal. So again, thank you to Jennifer, to Tasha, to Christian. Thank you for taking your time to be with us today. And thank you for everything that you do in our community. And we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
Great.